Hello, delegates. My name is TERI Solomon, and I am the head of the Finpro practice for Marsh in Africa. And I'm delighted to be presenting to you today, albeit I understand it is through a simulated CPU. For the technophobes amongst us, I'm not quite sure what that means. I do know that I would have far preferred to have presented in person and had the opportunity of meeting with all of you, and certainly hope to do so soon. I was asked to address you on the topic of cyber risks as they relate to the retirement fund industry and to retirement funds, and to just touch on some of the things that trustees can and possibly should be doing in order to manage and mitigate what is clearly a growing risk, a very huge risk for retirement funds, but also a very new and developing risk. So it is estimated that by the end of 2020, the global cost of cybercrime would have exceeded $1 trillion. And there's often this misconception that cyber events are all malicious. You know, that cyber risks or cyber hackers emanate from criminals lurking in dark corners, seeking to access computer systems for large ransomware, as an example. And whilst that's true to an extent for cyber liability insurance claims, where we see a large majority of the claims being paid out in the form of ransomware, it's also important to understand that significant losses from cyber can occur from mere errors, omissions, and accidents. So, for example, losing a laptop or losing a cell phone can lead to very large cyber losses, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. What is clear, though, is that the prevalence of these cyber attacks is set to increase as the sophistication of these cyber criminals increases. They generally tend to be one step ahead of law enforcement all the time, which is really worrying. But this trend is definitely not going to end, and it's certainly going to, I think, be set as the crime of the future. Of course, the financial, operational, and reputational impact on a business following a cyber event can be catastrophic, and I don't think that that is any different for retirement funds as separate legal entities. So we can ask ourselves, why is cyber risk and cyber risk management so important for retirement funds? And I think the first answer to the question is not just around the volume of data, but also the nature of the data that is held by funds. If you look at the volume of data, we have in South Africa some very large retirement funds, some where members exceed 50,000, and these funds hold, process, and manage immensely large volumes, or metadata, if you like, of personal and financial data, from ID numbers to home addresses, to family details in respect of beneficiaries. And so it makes the kind of data also very attractive to these cyber criminals. The other issue to bear in mind is the concentration of data. So the metadata is concentrated, if you like, on one IT platform, and that again makes it very attractive to cyber criminals. And the other aspect to bear in mind is the third-party exposure. So this extensive ecosystem, if you like, of third-party providers to the fund, whether it be the employer, whether it be the asset managers, the administrators, the actuary, they all play a role in utilizing and storing member data, and therefore increase the opportunity for member data to be lost, stolen, or compromised on their systems, on these particular systems. So what, of course, is important to note is that irrespective of whether the fund owns or operates an IT platform or an IT system, in terms of POPI, the law is very clear that the fund, as the data originator, is ultimately legally liable to its members. And as an extension of that, the information officer, who we know attracts huge personal liability under POPI, and of course the trustees in discharging their fiduciary duties towards the members, also face personal liability. So important, for funds and for the trustees going forward, given the advent of POPI, as well as, of course, taking into account the King IV principles around digital governance, for the board to take steps to identify, manage, and mitigate the cyber resilience of the fund. So what can boards do to address this going forward? I think the first thing that the board should be doing is to assess and minimize the risk of a cyber event. And the best way possibly to do that is to do various scenario planning. So the first, as an example, is to take a data flow. So, to track the data flow if in the event of a third-party administered fund, track the data flow from the from the employer through to the administrator and through perhaps to the asset manager, etc. And once you're tracking that data flow, then do a deep dive into each of the systems that are being utilized by those third-party service providers to ensure that they are safe and, of course, that they are very robust from a cyber resilience perspective. Another scenario could be an independent trustee's computer being hacked, a home PC being hacked, as we've seen examples of happening. Another one might be that a principal officer, as an example, his phone gets stolen. They may have Outlook on their phone, and hackers may be able to access the Outlook app, and as a result there gain access to member data. So doing these various scenario plans will really help the board understand what the risk could be in the event that something like this happens. The next step, I guess, is to ensure that the fund is then able to respond to an incident. Heaven forbid that it should happen, through the implementation of a very robust incident response plan. It is absolutely vital that the board understands that in the event of a claim, they know who to call, what to do, who not to speak to, for example, the press. Very critical that they understand from a member communication perspective and a regulator communication perspective what they can and should be doing. Having dealt with some of these claims before, cyber claims in the corporate space, I can absolutely tell you that time is of the essence in the event of a claim. There is simply no time to waste deciding who to speak to and who to call. One has to have a very robust incident response plan to respond and react timely to one of these events. So make sure that the response plan is there. I do think that it's going to be critical going forward. And then, to an extent possible, understand and quantify the possible impact that a cyber event might have on the fund. So if it's a self-administered fund, and for example, there's a denial of service attack and the systems are down for a couple of days or weeks, what does that mean from a business interruption perspective? What does that mean from not being able to process claims, as an example, or to receive contributions? And one would need to unpack the impact on the business. Of course, if it's a third-party administered fund, the possible impact may not be as big, but important to remember that if the breach happens on the third-party service provider's platform, what does that mean? And that will come out in those various scenario plans that the board is encouraged to do. And then I think, finally, trustees must very carefully consider the service level agreements that they have with all their third-party service providers. And insofar as doing that, make sure that those service level agreements ensure that advisors cannot contract out of liability for any cyber event, on top of which the SLA should prescribe that all third-party service providers do carry cyber liability insurance. That's absolutely critical. I think the board should possibly take it one step further, and once you've confirmed that your third-party service provider does have cyber liability insurance, it's then worth doing a bit of a deep dive into those policies and perhaps doing a diligence to ensure that your third-party service providers not only have cyber, but that it's robust from a coverage perspective, as well as, of course, from a limit perspective. Because the bottom line is that if there is an event on their platforms and for whatever reason their cyber insurance doesn't respond, it may well be that the fund bears the ultimate responsibility and liability for that loss. So if the Board of Trustees has not adequately diligenced the cyber insurance of their third-party service providers, that may come back to bite them. And then I think further to mitigate the risk, the board can and should, to the extent possible, look to transfer the risk through insurance. Whether it be a standalone cyber liability policy, which we advocate for large self-administered funds, or whether it be some sort of contingency data protection extension under the existing fidelity policy for the fund, the board should evidence that they have assessed the risk and assessed the right solution insofar as risk transfer or insurance is concerned. I must caveat that by saying that cyber liability insurance for the retirement fund industry is very new. It's somewhat murky, at this stage, as I think insurers are grappling to understand how to underwrite the risk. In a third-party administered fund, where the fund doesn't own or operate an IT system or an IT platform of its own, it is very difficult for the underwriters to underwrite or assess what the risk could be. Whereas, of course, in a self-administered fund, which owns and operates its own IT system, it's far easier for insurers to then analyze those systems and underwrite them to their satisfaction insofar as security measures are concerned. So it is difficult, and not all markets have got a solution to this as yet. And that's why I said right at the beginning of the talk, this really is a developing risk. And of course, we're trying to develop solutions around it. So what we at Marsh have been successful in doing in our portfolio of funds, and we look after just on 900 retirement funds, where we place the compulsory fidelity, liability, and trustee insurance for these funds. What we have managed to negotiate with the insurers is what we call the data protection extension. The data protection extension is really a contingent form of cyber liability that is available to the fund. It is not a compulsory form of insurance. It is elective, although of course we really encourage funds to buy it. And the data protection is there really, as I say, as contingent cover in the event that there is a cyber loss. So what the DPE will cover, it includes loss for liability following loss of or theft of member data, liability following a privacy breach, liability on the fund emanating from a breach of POPI, liability following the failure to disclose a privacy breach in line with POPI regulations to members. The DPE will also cover legal defense costs, which is very important, of course, in the event that there is a claim made against the fund. It will also cover the cost of any regulatory investigations, and I think those are definitely set to increase as we become more familiar with POPI. And finally, the data protection extension will also cover insurable fines and penalties under POPI to the extent that they are legally permissible or legally insurable. And finally, the crisis management costs, in other words, the member notification costs as required under POPI, would also be covered under the data protection extension. So as I say, a very important form of contingent liability for funds to purchase, and an option for them to do so. So admittedly, we haven't yet tested a claim in this space. So although we've had the data protection offered to our clients for around 3 or 4 years already, we haven't yet had the opportunity to test a claim and how the data protection will actually cover a claim. But again, it's not a case of if this is going to happen. I think it's a case in the retirement fund industry of when a data claim is going to happen. And I guess, being forewarned is being forearmed. And so hopefully some of the issues that we've discussed today and some of the pointers that I've given for boards to consider, will really enable them to be prepared a little bit better in the event that there is such a claim or such an incident. It's been a pleasure addressing you all today, as always. Again, I would have far preferred to have done this in person and not have to watch myself on a video screen, which is pretty awful. But Chris, I must say, great job on the digital platform. I think it's really innovative, something new and refreshing. So thank you for having me again. Please do feel free to reach out to me with any concerns or any questions, any queries. I will leave my details with Chris. My email address, TERI, TERI.Solomon, SOLOMON, @marsh.com. As I say, please feel free to reach out anytime, and hopefully look forward to seeing you in person soon. Thank you for the opportunity again.